এবং ইতিহাসের বিভিন্ন বিষয় আমরা আসলে ডিসকাশন করতেছিলাম, স্পেশালি অটোমানদের কে নিয়ে আমাদের ফ্যাসিনেশন বেশি। আমাদের ফ্যাসিনেশন হওয়ারও একটা স্বাভাবিক রিজন আছে খিলাফত। এবং রিসেন্টলি একটা কথা আসলে একজন বলতেছিল, যে জিনিসটা আমার কাছে খুবই ভাল লাগছে এবং ট্রিগার্ড করছে, যে ইরানিয়ানরা বা শিয়া মাযহাব যদি তুমি দেখো, তারা দুনিয়ার যে কোনো প্রান্তেই হোক, এখন আয়াতুল্লাহ খামেনিকে তারা ইমাম মানে অনেকটাই তুমি খিলাফতের মতোই আসলে চিন্তা করতে পারো। সো তারা শিয়াইজম থ্রু আউট হিস্টোরিতে কিন্তু মাযহাবের মতো একটা বিহেভ করেনি। তারা ইসলামের অনলি ওয়ে বা ইসলামের একটা ধারা হিসেবে তারা প্রেজেন্ট করতো, কোনো মাযহাব না কিন্তু, মানে বাকিদেরকে তারা কিন্তু মানতোই না। বাট ওই জিনিসটা তোমার এখন তারা কিছুটা আসলে শিথিল হয়েছে। তো ইরানিয়ানরা তুমি দেখবা যে যখন তারা ইরানের উপর কোন অ্যাটাক হওয়ার চিন্তা করে, তারা সাডেনলি চিন্তা করা শুরু করে যে আমাদের ইমাম মারা গেলে আমাদের শিয়া মাযহাব বা যেই জান্নাত জাহান্নামের একটা কনসেপ্ট তারা আসলে নিয়ে আনে। যে জিনিসটা আমরা আসলে সবসময় করতাম, যে কোনো বড় খিলাফত ধ্বংস হইলেই বলতাম যে এন্ড টাইম আইসা পড়ছে। তো ইরানিয়ানরা একটা উইয়ার্ড ফ্যাসিনেশনের ভিতর দিয়ে আসলে যাইতেছে। ওই সেম ওয়েতে আমাদের অটোমানদেরকে নিয়ে আসলে আসলে ফ্যাসিনেশন ওটা বড় নেচার, এটা কোনো অস্বাভাবিক কোনো কিছু না। বাট সামহাও তুর্কিশরা এত বেশি ন্যাশনালিস্টিক হওয়ার পরেও না, আমাদের দেখবা তুর্কিশ ওই ন্যাশনালিজমটা কিন্তু আমরা আসলে ওন করা শুরু করছি এখন, ঠিক আছে? এবং ওইখানে আসলে ইস্যু নাই, আমি বললাম তো ওই জিনিসটা খুবই নর্মাল এবং এই জিনিসটা হওয়াটা খুবই অস্বাভাবিক কোনো কিছু না। সো অটোমানদের ভিতরে যা যা হয়েছে ওটাকেও কিন্তু আমরা এখন অ্যাবসোলুট মানে ওয়েতে আসলে প্রেজেন্ট করার চেষ্টা করি, যেটা আসলে উচিত না। অটোমানরা এট দ্য এন্ড অফ দ্য ডে খিলাফত ছিল, একটা এম্পায়ার ছিল। এবং হিউম্যান বিহেভিয়ারে আমরা যেভাবে দৈনন্দিন জীবনে ভালো কাজ করি, প্লাস এমন এমন কাজও করি যা আমার ইমিডিয়েট কোনো বেনিফিট দেয় বা যা করা আসলে উচিত না। সো অটোমানরা প্রচুর পরিমাণে কিন্তু যুদ্ধের ভিতরে লিপ্ত ছিল এবং তারা প্রচুর পরিমাণে যুদ্ধ করতো। সো সাম্য তাদেরকে তাদের অ্যাকশন প্রত্যেকটাকে আসলে ইসলামিক লেন্সে দেখার ফলে আমরা যদি প্রত্যেকটা বিষয়কে আবার ইসলামিক কজ দেওয়া শুরু করি যে এই জিনিসটা ইসলামের জন্য হয়েছে, ওই জিনিসটা আসলে উচিত না আমার মতে। এবং এই জিনিসটা এখন অনেকেই করা আসলে বন্ধ করছে, কিছুটা কিছুটা শিথিল হয়েছে। যে অটোমানরা ইসলামকে এট দ্য এন্ড অফ দ্য ডে ওন করছে, প্লাস তারা তাদের নিজস্ব কিছু স্বার্থ আছে, যেরকম এখন ইরানের আছে, ইরানের নিজস্ব কিছু স্বার্থ আছে। তাদের একটা মডার্ন স্টেট যেভাবে ফাংশন করে ওইভাবে তাদের ফাংশন করতে হয়। প্লাস তারা ওই শিয়া মাযহাবের যে খিলাফত, যে ইমামাত তারা ওন করছে, ওই জিনিসটাকেও তারা ক্যারি করে। কোনোটা কিন্তু আসলে অ্যাবান্ডন করার প্রয়োজন হয়নি। সো একই তুমি ধারায় অটোমানদেরকে তোমার ওন করতে হবে, প্লাস অটোমানদেরকে নিন্দাও করতে হবে। সবকিছু পজিটিভিটি বের করার চেষ্টা করার দরকার নেই, সবকিছু আবার নেগেটিভ ওয়েতেও আসলে দেখার কোনো বই নেই। দুইটাকে আসলে ব্যালেন্স করতে হবে। রাদার দেন ব্যালেন্স করা, আমরা যদি অন্যদিকে এত ওভার রোমান্টিসাইজ করি তা আসলে উচিত না, যেটা এখন ইরানিদের সাথে হইতেছে। ইরানিরা আসলে এখন ফিল করতেছে যে কোনো সময় আমেরিকা অ্যাটাক করতে পারে, যে কোনো সময় তারা ওই বিল্ড আপ, তারা ওই শিয়া মাযহাবে যে খিলাফত আসলে তারা ডেভেলপ করছে, তো তাদের শেষ হয়ে যেতে পারে। সো তারা এখন, এতদিন দেখতাম শিয়ারা মুসলিম তোমার সুন্নিদেরকে নিয়ে হাসি ঠাট্টা করতো, যে অটোমানদেরকে এত বেশি ভালোবাসে, অটোমান স্কার্ট পরে, অটোমান ওরা কিন্তু রিলিজিয়াস না। অটোমান তো না, তুর্কিশদের কথা বলতেছে, তুর্কিশরা কিন্তু এত বেশি রিলিজিয়াস না। সো ইরানিরা এতদিন যেই হাসি ঠাট্টা করতো, সামহাও এখন অনেক শিয়া মাযহাবের অনুসারীরা অনুভব করতেছে যে না, সুন্নিরা এতদিন যে ইমোশনটা আসলে শেয়ার করতো আমাদের সাথে, এখন আমরা সামহাও রেজোনেন্স করতে পারতেছি যে হ্যাঁ, আমাদের শিয়া মাযহাবের দিকে যখন এখন আমেরিকা অলমোস্ট যুদ্ধ করার একটা পরিস্থিতিতে আছে, এবং এবার যদি যুদ্ধ হয় এটা আসলে শেষের দিকে হবে, মানে সকল কিছু আসলে শেষের দিকে হবে, যে এই শিয়া মাযহাবের যে খিলাফতরা ডেভেলপ করছে এটা মোস্টলি আসলে শেষ হয়ে যাবে এবং ছোট ছোট ফ্র্যাকশন আসলে ভাগ করে দিবে। এবং একটা সেকুলার রাষ্ট্র বা একটা সেকুলার গভর্নমেন্ট সেট আপ করার চেষ্টা করবে। পরবর্তী সময় কি হয় এটা ভিন্ন হিসাব, বাট মোস্টলি বিভিন্ন ফ্র্যাকচার আসলে ভাগ করে দিবে আমেরিকা। সো যে পয়েন্ট আসলে আমরা ছিলাম যে অটোমানদের বিভিন্ন ইস্যু আছে কথা বলার জন্য, একটা সিঙ্গেল ধারায় আমরা যেতে করে অটোমানদেরকে না ফেলে। অটোমানরা আমি বললাম একটা এম্পায়ার ছিল, একটা ডাইনাস্টি ছিল, একটা নির্দিষ্ট পরিবার ছিল, তাদের বহু ভালো দিক আছে, বহু খারাপ দিকও আছে। বাট ইসলামের থেকে আসলে অনেকে খারিজ করে, অনেক আলেমরা বলে যে না, অটোমানরা ইসলামের না, একটা মুসলিম এম্পায়ার ছিল, মাঝে মাঝে কোনো কিছু ফায়দা দিলে নিত, বাট এরকম না, তারা ইসলামিক ওয়েতেও বিহেভ করছে। তাদের রাষ্ট্র অনেক বেশি কিন্তু ইসলামিক কনসেন্স, তাদের লিটারালি একটা বিশাল বড় উলামায়ে ইউনো ক্লাস ছিল যারা রাষ্ট্র চালাইতো। সো এমন আসলে বলার উপায় নাই। সো আজকে আমরা যে বিষয়ে কথা বলবো যে অটোমানদের ভিতরে ইহুদিরা কিভাবে থাকতো এবং ইহুদিরা তাদের রোল কি ছিল, তাদের উপর আসলে কতটুকু হারমোনি শো করা হয়েছে। যদিও এখন ইহুদিরা এই জিনিসটাকে অনেক ডিনাই করে, বাট মোস্টলি অটোমানদের ইতিহাসে ইহুদিদের সাথে রিয়েলি কোনো কনফ্লিক্ট আছে। যদি তুমি এই জিনিসটা আশেপাশে সামান্যতম কনজিউম করো, তুমি রিয়েলি দেখবা যে না, তাদের সাথে অটোমানদের, ইহুদিদের সাথে অটোমানদের কোনো মানে ফাইট হওয়ার কোনো ওয়েই নেই। একদম রিসেন্টলি মানে শেষ 100 বছর যখন জায়নিস্টরা একটা রাষ্ট্র গঠন করার চেষ্টা করতেছিল, তখন আসলে গিয়ে কিছুটা ইউনো মনোমালিন্য হয়েছে, বাট এছাড়া থ্রু আউট হিস্টোরিতে অটোমানদের সাথে ইহুদিদের কিন্তু কোনো ইস্যু নাই। ঠিক আছে, এত বেশি আসলে তোমার হারমোনি ছিল ইহুদিদের সাথে। আচ্ছা, আমরা শুরু করি।
Turkish society, Turkish politics, and so forth. Were these Jews that were first to become Muslim? So the idea is in about 1648 to 1666, I think those are the numbers. Yeah. There was a particular rabbi in Salonika who had called himself the Messiah, and the idea was that he was preaching a sort of a messianic narrative. Afterwards, he becomes Muslim, and the whole tribe that's around him also becomes Muslim. The idea of donne means to turn, right? But it was suggested at least that they hadn't really converted to Islam at all, but in actuality they were still holding these beliefs. And they were critiqued by Jews at the time as well, because of the views that were so extreme. As time's gone on, they sort of like internalized that particular identity. I mean, throughout moments of contemporary history, there has been forms of criticism literature written about them. They would have been, there's no real evidence. So
they were attained political position.
So the conspiracy theory, if we're going to put that out there, so that people are aware, is that they were the masterminds behind the three Masonic lodges and so forth, and then they're the ones who aligned themselves with the Zionist situation. And that's
then shifted up.
So I haven't investigated that narrative to actually. It wasn't something that was important to me. So
how prevalent is that theory amongst Turks in Turkey today?
I don't know how prevalent it is, but there are works that have been written on that for sure. There are people that believe that. And not just in terms of from left-leaning thinkers that have written about this to some degree, but a lot of this can't be categorically substantial. And there's a lot of narrative construction,
sure,
and so on. So that's the dominant issue. Now, in terms of the lives of Jews in the Ottoman Empire, the Jews were safeguarded on the Ottoman Empire in ways that it's really interesting. So, for example, when Andalusia's happened and people being forced out, it's Jews and Muslims who come to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire took them spaces to be able to profit from life in the Ottoman world. And up until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there were many Jewish communities who did not subscribe to the Zionist ideology. In fact, resisted it for a very long time. Because
Jews.
Yes, absolutely. And so I'm just having the same, one of, I think his doctor was a Jew. So the Ottomans, in that sense, didn't have this notion of, there's this misconception of Ottoman tolerance towards non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. That's not, the word tolerance is incorrect here. What the Ottomans are doing, were able to accommodate and negotiate for the rights of non-Muslims to be able to live under the world of the Ottoman world. And once again, were there confessional tensions and differences? Yes, there were. I'm not going to sugarcoat over that. But by and large, one would say that the Jewish community were living under the Ottoman Empire in which their practice of Judaism was protected. so that they could practice Judaism freely, and not be, subjugated by anyone because of that. And the state was very clear that if there was any forms of attempt of forced conversion by Muslims or non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, to the state itself would come down heavy on them. That was never the intention. In many years. And Jews flourished just like anyone else. So in the 19th century, when we see an upward turn in regards to literature, so Arabic literature, which they called, and Ottoman literature, we see an increase also in Armenian and Jewish literature at the time. What's even interesting is if you read works by Jews at the time, they're subscribing to notions of justice that feel very Islamic in the way that they're living under a world where there's a lot of cross-pollination taking place in terms of ideas. But then that changes, of course, after the creation of the Zionist state. And they have a different sort of pull of power in terms of what they believe most Jews should subscribe to. And that's the world we're in today. I mean, I don't know what type of tensions Jews are having right now in terms of the genocide. But I'm sure that there are some.
Is one of the ways in which the Ottoman state negotiated the rights of Jews and Christians to practice their religion within their domains, was that embodied and represented by the millet system?
So the millet system, for those who don't know, was that religious communities were permitted to live within an ecosystem of their own religious community, right, and practice law and so forth. In the 19th century, that shifts a little bit because of modernity, in which there's an emergence of what you call a new intelligentsia, and the sort of like millet system in the eyes of the Ottomans maybe was not fit for purpose. Yeah. But the Ottoman, if you look at the Islahat from 1856, to various edicts that come after, the Ottomans are very careful of making sure that the integrity and the makeup of the religious communities are not disrupted by the changes that are taking place in government. They're just being readjusted because of the change in times. In fact, the Ottomans were careful that people who were not Muslim, their collective, and this is the difference here, it's a collective religious identity, because they saw themselves as communities rather than individuals who worship. So it's not like, when we talk about the Armenian church or the Greek Orthodox church, this is a community. Whereas today, people see themselves as a sum of individuals who go to church to practice. So with that community came not only practices of religiosity and going to church and having a hierarchy, but they had cultural practices that was coming from their faith. And it was the job of the Ottoman Empire in terms of the veneer of Islam to make sure it safeguarded that, because it's in the interest of an Islamic government that believes in Allah and God to make sure that other God-fearing communities are also safeguarded, because there's a commonality here. It's not in the interest to deconstruct that. The assumption is that Muslims will go out their way to force them to become Muslim. That's not what was happening, because it upsets the balance in the Ottoman Empire. It causes tensions that are unnecessary. And the Ottomans, up until the collapse, and then we would say maybe the anomaly was in World War I, where things totally went out of control, fundamentally subscribed to that way of practicing.
Why did they do away with the millet then?
So in the 19th century, you start to see modernization taking place, and communities themselves, non-Muslim communities themselves, are now trying to renegotiate how they identify themselves.
With nationalist aspirations.
Nationalist aspirations is one aspect of it, but even like I said, an emergence of a new intelligentsia that was questioning its own clergy class, and so on. So it was in of itself the way that they were looking at their own forms of power configurations as communities, and so the state would step in as a way of being a sort of like referee, perhaps, to help these communities maintain the integrity of the communities. When we talk about modernity, we talk about it as just one big flat line. But modernity is not this just box that went on the Ottoman Empire. Different peoples were engaging with transitioning, becoming modern citizens or subjects in different ways. Some peoples was a lot faster, and other peoples not so much. Like, not only non-Muslims and Muslims, but even like Muslims and Muslims, where in Istanbul, the modernization efforts were a lot more faster than nomadic areas and other parts of the Ottoman domains. So modernity wasn't a one flat track, right? But non-Muslims in the Ottoman domains who had interactions outside of the Ottoman world and so forth had different types of demands. So it's not that the Ottomans are imposing a deconstruction of the millet. It's the millet itself, which is making the case that we have different requirements because of the change in world and change in times and the change in the community. Then the Ottoman state has to respond to that by finding a new type of legal grammar that can help them understand that. So that's what we're actually at.
All right, so let me tell you about Hugs Pro. There's this quote that's stuck to help UK example of citation of a Sunni Islamist project succeeding, at least in attaining power and projecting that power through cultural manifestations, soft power, you name it, nostalgia, whatever you may call it, however you want to describe it. Because now I'm being super cautious about my wording. But look, he himself has, in many occasions, made very clear references to Ottoman past in a nostalgic way, in a romantic way.
আসসালামু আলাইকুম। আমরা ধারাবাহিকভাবেই আজকে চতুর্থ দিনে আছি। আসসালামু আলাইকুম। আমরা ধারাবাহিকভাবে আসসালামু আলাইকুম। আমরা ধারাবাহিকভাবেই আজকে চতুর্থ দিনে আছি।
What Abdul Hamid was able to do, make Muslims at least, probably on many occasions better informed than we are today in regards to the political ingoings and ongoings of what's happening in the centre. So the reason why I bring that caveat is because that term was used by the British as a way of, to some degree, trying to regulate the Ottoman sort of like policies regarding the Khilafah, the Caliphate and so on. And that term stuck. And on many Ottoman historians and academics use that term, carte blanche. The policies or the terminology that the Ottomans used was Ittihad Islam. So it's sort of like the idea of Islamic unity, right? And that has a different sort of a conceptual meaning to it. And people say it translates the same, but it doesn't.
Would Islamiyun be inaccurate?
No, that wouldn't be inaccurate. That would be something that we could work with. Or in the Turkish, they will say Islam dunya, so the Muslim world, or so the Islamic world, or so forth. Now, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but these things are important.
No,
so people will say things like the Muslim world is a modern construction and so forth. No, Muslims have been visualizing the idea of belonging to a Muslim world for centuries. The idea is, then someone will say, well, what does that mean to belong to the Muslim world? Fundamentally, it means that Islam, in its political form, in its execution of certain legal practices and infused in culture, was the dominant hegemony that people were judging themselves by, both Muslims and non-Muslims. So India would be seen as part of the Muslim world. Spain at one point was part of the Muslim world. Today you'd have to say it isn't, because all of that, what I've just mentioned, has been extracted out.
Sure.
So the Ummah do go beyond the Muslim world, and so we Muslims living in the West perhaps are considered as part of the Ummah, but Britain would not be considered part of the Muslim world. So that's not some sort of, just linguistic gymnastics. Those things need to be qualified, just because that's how Muslims self-identified. Now, the reason why this becomes important about pan-Islamism as well is the distinction made between the idea of pan-Islamism and the idea of Ummah. That somehow the Ummah is a religious community. It's not a political community. And in fact, that's also not true historically. We see that the Ummah identified their religiosity with their politics. And the Ummah didn't see themselves as a set of identities in the way that we see it today. Yeah. In fact, even now in Britain, people will ask me, how do you write about minorities in Britain? And I would say, I do write about minorities, by the way. It was just the Ottomans. What Muslims can't conceptualize or visualize, perhaps, is the idea of having power. That's an anomaly in their mind. And the way that they see power at times is in Muslim majority countries, in which they would subscribe to the idea that that's still not Islamic power. And then there's been a lot of attack on the way that Islam would represent power. But anyone who's got any worth of salt would know that when we talk about power in Islam, it has to be held to a particular ethical and moral standard.
Sure.
So that caveat is important because Abdul Hamid then, as a caliph, and it was also a contention point even in the Ottoman Empire, which is what was his remit in regards to his interaction with the Ummah. Now, there is an academic by the name of Jan Peter Hartung. He makes this argument about Muslim communities are emotional communities, making the case that not emotional in terms of they are erratic, but emotional in the sense that religion as a sort of language and
Matters.
vocabulary speaks to both power and those who are being ruled. And power uses a set of language, symbols and rhetoric, and the ruled under them require those symbols, language and rhetoric. They both understand the relationship. In fact, they require those hierarchies as a way of making society function.
What do you think of that?
I think it's an interesting way of conceptualizing it, from an academic perspective.
You think there's truth in it?
Yeah, I think so to some degree. I'm willing to go with it. And so if we're going to use the argument of an Islamic state, quote unquote, in today's vocabulary, perhaps, then it wouldn't be far-fetched to say that an Islamic state is an emotional state in the sense that fundamentally there is an ethical and moral core within the political structure that has to be held to account by a higher power. Accountability then is not simply one that's executed in this life. There's an accountability of the next life. That is infused in all the members that make up the ummah, which means the average layman to the one who's wielding authority. That's throughout Islamic discourse of political thought. So once again, going back to Abdul Hamid then, and this sort of like painting that I'm painting for you a little bit, it's important because when we say pan-Islamism, what we're actually doing is we're constructing a language of outside looking in, right? But I'm Muslim. So what I'm saying is, how do they self-identify internally? So acts of dawah, for example, are not, if we were to conceptualize that as Muslim missionary activity, it doesn't quite capture what dawah is in terms of an invitation to Islam.
No.
And so on. So here, I think and we spoke about this the last time when we were talking about the Ottomans and Empire, and so on, and how language matters, right? And how we exercise language, how we use it. So for me, what I'm trying to do, perhaps as a historian, is by giving the Ottomans their agency back, is to give them the right to use, or I should use the vocabulary they were using to identify themselves or to express their policies. Now, those policies, in regards to Abdul Hamid,
was Abdul Hamid okay, as an ustad on this particular subject, allow me to reframe it then. Would it be then correct to then say, was Khalifa Abdul Hamid unique or distinct to his predecessors in the way he approached and envisaged his state and polity?
In some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. So there's two aspects of this. In many ways, he was a continuation of the people that came before, people like Abdul Majid and Sultan Abdul Aziz and so forth. They all had this philosophy, especially after 1839, we call the post-Tanzimat policies, of reforming the Ottoman Empire, but also making Islam, or the language of Islam, far more, pronounced. Because there was a concern that Muslims at that moment were feeling the absolute force of Western colonialism. And listen, during this moment, this is not just a phenomenon from the Ottomans. You'll see the emergence of many movements, from the Wahhabi movement to the reformist Salafist movement to the Ahl al-Hadith movement,
Abdul Afghani,
to the Deobandis, to the Naqshbandis and so forth. These general movements around the Muslim world in trying to respond to this colonial intervention, right? And so in that sense, the Ottoman state also recognizes this. What Abdul Hamid is different from his predecessors is he's successfully been able to then curate policies that were far more efficient and effective in dealing with allowing Muslims to sort of like survive and have a vocabulary and a grammar that can deal with that colonial intervention, both locally within the Ottoman domains and then projecting it outside the Ottoman domains. That was unique. The idea that Abdul Hamid II was able to speak to Muslims around the world. And I was speaking to a brother only today when I was coming in the car from Manchester. And I said, one of the things that people sometimes forget about Sultan Abdul Hamid II is that even though maybe he wasn't able to save the empire, but he managed to safeguard the legacy of the empire. Right? I'm using this word empire loosely here before people lose their minds a little bit. There is an article for anyone who's interested by Sanjay Subramaniam who says that not all empires are the same. Right? There is this academic discourse, and that the Ottoman Empire, if we're going to use this term lightly in English, loosely in the English medium, is a different empire than the Western empires.
But the usage of the word itself doesn't necessarily mean they're all the same.
It doesn't mean they're all the same, exactly. And I'm going off tangent once again, and people in the
tangents are good.
Yeah, people in the comments can go bananas on me if they want, and it's not a problem, and I'll deal with that later. But I'm just saying I might be slippage in and out of this, and
Sure.
don't hold me on that. But what Abdul Hamid was able to do was make Muslims at least maintain in their memory the idea that a ethical, moral, political entity needs to exist. So this is why you see the emergence of the Khilafat Committee in India at the time, right? And even the formation of the idea of Pakistan at the time comes from this idea because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. There was a particular feeling of loss and then recognition that it's not going to return.
It was the marriage of the son of the Nizam of Hyderabad to the daughter of the Ottoman Caliph an attempt to preserve that?
Yeah, it was, and I think it's Imran Mullah who's written a book on this. Yeah, and it's a very good read, and I'm really proud of him in terms of what he's put forward and positive. And he actually took the initiative himself at such a young age to actually go out and investigate this. It's a very good form of investigative historical work.
So was that marriage a manifestation of the things that you're describing?
The marriage was in this what we call interwar period, an attempt to try to safeguard something that had collapsed in front of them. And you can see the remnants of that. But that's not the only remnants. I mean, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, you see many of the ulama and thinkers around the world, and you see this in the works of Maulana Hassan, who makes the case that there was a real yearning and longing for something that had gone, because the immediate consequences of the collapse of empire was catastrophic for the Ummah. In fact, the lowest point is not 1924 for the Ummah. In fact, when you read the historical accounts, it continues until 1950 with the creation of the State of Israel. In fact, much of our imagination today regarding how we see ourselves in the world is a post-1950s world. The 19th century is still very different from the 20th century. And so what happens in the 1950s? You have the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You have the fall of the Meiji dynasty and so on. You have partition in India taking place and the British losing India. The British as an alien empire is now gone. So colonialism in the form that we know it is sort of like disappearing. We have the creation of the State of Israel. We have the creation of the United Nations, NATO, and the sort of global infrastructure we have, and we have the rise of the United States of America as a superpower. Fundamentally, that's the world that we've been living in and couched in for the last decades, right?
70 years.
What's interesting right now, perhaps, and this is another tangent, is it seems like the Israelis and the Americans have decided that they want to reset that world order that they created because it's not working for them anymore. But the point I'm trying to make is a lot of how we imagine the 19th century is collapsed in from ideas that came from the 20th century, like the idea of the modernization theory and so forth. And many Muslim Orientalists who emerged from the Muslim world, or even Muslim thinkers who to some degree had this particular complex because their imaginations were restricted to that, have often written from that perspective. But the 19th century, going back to even the attempt to revive the Ottoman Caliphate, there's a lot of interesting things that happened there pre-World War II. And these moments are important. That there's a world before World War One. There's an interworld period between World War One and World War Two, and then there's a new world that's created post World War Two, which is the world that we've been living in for so long, and that's the imagination that we have regarding the 19th century that needs to change. Now, going back to Abdul Hamid, because I went off on this tangent.
No, this sounds important.
Is that Abdul Hamid became a victim in the historiography of the post-1950s world, which wanted to show that the Ottoman past was a decadent past to some degree. Now, many contemporary Ottoman historians, who are non-Muslim, by the way, would question that. And what Abdul Hamid was able to do, I guess, is recognize that to safeguard the Ottoman world and the Ottoman domains, it was important that he provided at least some vocabulary for the Muslims around the world to sort of like escape from the colonial rope that was around their neck.
Was he successful in that?
Well, there's nothing he could do about what was happening to Muslims around the world. So people keep asking me, did the Ottomans fail the Muslim world?
But they adopt his framing, what he was trying to normalize at a time where the Ummah needed its own framing, its own discourse. Was he successful in those outside of the domains in adopting that framing?
I think...
being influenced by it?
I think the influence is there, for sure. I remember growing up as a kid, hearing Jummah khutbas in my local Deoband masjid, still praising Sultan Abdul Hamid II, because those khutbas were being given in India at the time. So this is not new in that sense. But what's unique, I guess, power is capable of writing about itself, right? And people often, the adage is that the ones who win the war, Churchill, they can write regarding how they have power. Now, the British Empire still exists, or the empire's gone. Britain still exists, and it's residually declining rapidly, but it's managed to still project and manifest an understanding that it was an empire, and it still belongs to a Western hegemonic bloc. It needs that, but the Ottomans don't exist, so they can't write that history. And so that agency is lost to who? To the academies around the world. But alhamdulillah.
So history is written by the victors.
To some degree, but what's very unique here is there's people like myself and others who somehow have found a way of, like a small plant coming through the concrete wall. And in that sense, the Ummah have found ways of talking about Ottoman history in this sense. What's been disappointing for me, perhaps, is every time I've spoke about Ottoman history, not as somebody who has a religious devotion to the Ottomans and this immense, devotional bias to them. I'm a historian. I want to make that very clear to whoever's watching this right now, which is my job is to be as truthful and as I can be about writing about the Ottoman Empire. And I do that with all Islamic history when I work on. In fact, I do that on all histories that I work on. I've been writing recently about the Meiji dynasty, right? The assumption is that because I write about the Ottomans, that somehow it's okay to just attack me and call me a sellout and all these sort of things. And, this is not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do here, perhaps, is I want Muslims to remove that 600-year blind spot that they have, because I think that's detrimental. I'm not trying to sugarcoat over things that the Ottomans did. I don't think that's helpful as a historian. But alhamdulillah, and I'll say this from a Muslim perspective perhaps, that the izzah of the Ottomans has by and large remained in the minds and hearts of the Ummah, fundamentally because, one, Allah Ta'ala has given the permission for that to exist. Absolutely. Allah Ta'ala could have easily removed any form of positive understanding of the Ottomans if they were fundamentally against the ideas of Islam. I believe that as a Muslim. But secondly, that there are many who really recognize that there is an importance of understanding that moment of history. And it's important to understand at one point in the history of the Muslim world, Istanbul was the center. And people, that's gone from their imagination perhaps. Now they just see Istanbul as a holiday destination where they have kebabs and take pictures of mosques. But at one point, that was the center of power. And when you look at that, and then you travel around the Balkans and the Muslim world and so forth, and you see how that power was exercised for at least 400 years in the region, it did some amazing things. And I always say, when you're looking at a painting, don't look at the brush strokes of the painting. Take a step back and look at the painting as a whole. The obsession of being sultanic orientated, which is only to do history from the perspective of the Sultan, and not look at the Ottomans as a larger civilization. It sort of detracts and takes away from all the things that they did. You do not stay in power for between 400 and 600 years by having the boot on the neck. That doesn't work. No. We're seeing that right now. People will move against you. A couple of decades, perhaps, if you're lucky. And then there's an agitation. So something must have been working for there to be a reciprocal form of negotiation between